The sound of the sea mixes with the distant echo of iron chains. Imagine a port at the beginning of the 17th century. Slave ships crossed the Atlantic, bringing not only imprisoned bodies, but also stories, cultures, and dreams torn from their roots. It was the beginning of a deep wound that would forever mark the United States and millions of enslaved Africans. Slavery did not begin suddenly, but rather as part of a calculated process of exploitation fueled by greed, the triangular trade, and colonial expansion. The first Africans arrived in 1619 aboard a ship called the White Lion, disembarking in the colony of Virginia. For many, this was just a distant episode, but in reality, it was the landmark that gave rise to centuries of forced labor, pain, structural racism, and resistance. You may be asking yourself, why revisit such a painful history? Because understanding the past is the key to comprehending the present. The slave quarters, the whipping posts, the lash, the pillory, the iron chains, and the slave ships are not only symbols of suffering, but also of resilience and struggle. Every detail of this journey helps us see how today's inequalities were born from choices made more than 4 centuries ago. In this video, we will travel back to the origins of slavery in the United States. You will discover how a small group of Africans disembarking in Virginia set in motion a cruel system that would grow until it imprisoned millions of people. We will explore how plantation masters, the big house, and the tobacco and cotton fields became the stage for brutal punishments, sexual abuse, and silent resistance. But this is not just a dive into pain. It is also an opportunity to recognize the courage of those who resisted, those who escaped, those who formed maroon communities, and those who kept their culture alive even under the worst conditions. It is a reminder that, despite chains and lashes, freedom never ceased to be the strongest dream. Prepare yourself to understand how it all began. Because knowing about the first arrival of Africans in North America is to recognize that this history is not only in books, it still breathes in every inequality, in every fight for justice, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. At the beginning of the 16th century, the world was undergoing a profound transformation. The so-called New World had been reached, and powers such as Spain and Portugal fiercely competed for control of the seas and the exploitation of newly discovered lands. Soon, England, France, and the Netherlands would also enter this race, each seeking to expand its power through maritime trade and colonization. At the heart of this process was the exploitation of natural resources and, above all, the need for labor to sustain the new colonial economies. While Portugal and Spain consolidated a brutal system of exploitation with the massive use of enslaved Africans in Brazil and the Caribbean, England began taking its first steps in the lands that would later become the United States. The 13 British colonies were still small communities, but they were already shaping themselves around agriculture that demanded large-scale labor. Tobacco production, especially in Virginia, would soon become the engine of the local economy. But there was a problem. Who would cultivate these lands? At first, the colonists turned to poor Europeans who crossed the Atlantic in search of opportunity. These workers, known as indentured servants, sold several years of their lives in exchange for passage to America. However, this workforce was limited, temporary, and costly. When their contracts ended, these men and women gained freedom and sought their own land, creating a dilemma for wealthy colonists who desired permanent and submissive laborers. This is the point where the transatlantic slave trade enters, one of the largest and cruelest systems of human exploitation in history. Millions of Africans were torn from their villages, bound in iron chains, placed on slave ships, and transported under inhumane conditions. The triangular trade became the central mechanism. From Europe came weapons, textiles, and manufactured goods. From Africa, enslaved Africans. From the Americas, tobacco, sugar, cotton, and wealth returned to fuel European expansion. This economic cycle transformed lives into merchandise. Every man, woman, and child kidnapped from Africa was seen only as a number in a cold ledger, valued solely for their capacity to work. The torment began on the African coast itself, where they were confined in forts and barracks before facing the Atlantic crossing, a true ordeal of hunger and thirst where many died before even reaching their destination. In the context of the Americas, slavery was not new. Indigenous peoples had already been subjected to forced labor since the arrival of Europeans. However, epidemics brought by colonizers and systematic massacres drastically reduced the native population. For the colonists, Africans represented a more durable solution. They were seen as more resistant to local diseases and as a workforce that could be exploited generation after generation. As the English colonies grew, the contrast between the ideals of liberty defended by Europe and the reality of slavery became striking. While Enlightenment philosophers spoke of universal rights, equality, and dignity, millions of Africans were whipped, chained, and forced to live in slave quarters. This paradox would shape not only the economy, but also the contradictory identity of the United States, a country that would be born proclaiming liberty while at the same time institutionalizing slavery. Another essential point to understand this period is the economic geography. In the South, the fertility of the soil and the climate favored large-scale agriculture. Plantations of tobacco, rice, and later cotton depended completely on enslaved labor. In the North, with its more diversified economy and less agricultural dependence, slavery existed, but on a smaller scale. This initial difference would create a gap that, 2 centuries later, would culminate in the Civil War. But before reaching those developments, it is necessary to understand how the beginning of the 17th century established the foundations of this institution. The colonists who arrived in America did not see slavery as something extraordinary. On the contrary, they saw it as a natural part of the order of the world. In Europe, racism was already being used to justify the supposed inferiority of African peoples, a convenient rationale for turning human beings into merchandise. And so, while the triangular trade expanded and the plantations of the South flourished, the arrival of the first Africans in Virginia in 1619 was not an isolated event, but part of a much larger movement. A movement that would transform entire societies, build fortunes, and leave deep scars on the collective memory of humanity. This is the foundation upon which the next part of our journey will stand, because now that we understand the global and colonial scenario, we can dive into the exact moment when the first Africans set foot on North American soil. The Atlantic crossing, the cultural shock, the initial violence. It is at this point that the history of slavery in the United States truly begins. It was the summer of 1619 when a ship called the White Lion docked in the colony of Virginia. At first sight, it seemed like just another vessel among the intense maritime traffic of the Atlantic. But that landing would not be just an isolated episode. It would mark the official beginning of African slavery on North American soil. There, at the port of Point Comfort, 20 Africans were traded like merchandise, exchanged for supplies. This moment would be remembered by history as the seed of a tragedy that would expand for more than 2 centuries. These men and women were not mere numbers. They came from the kingdom of Ndongo in the region of present-day Angola. They had families, cultures, languages, and traditions of their own. They were warriors, farmers, mothers, fathers, children. Many had been captured in local wars, imprisoned by traffickers, and sold to Portuguese traders who dominated routes along the African coast. Transported under subhuman conditions aboard slave ships, they were subjected to the torment of hunger, thirst, disease, and violence during the so-called Middle Passage. The White Lion was not traveling alone. Another ship, called the Treasurer, also carried Africans destined for the Americas. Both had seized their captives from a Portuguese slave ship, stealing the human cargo to resell it in English colonies. Thus, the first Africans did not arrive voluntarily, nor as simple contracted workers. They were plundered, torn from their lands, and reduced to merchandise. However, the English colony did not yet have written laws that defined slavery as we know it. For this reason, these first Africans were initially treated as indentured servants, a temporary condition similar to that of poor European workers. But that resemblance was only superficial. While a European servant could gain freedom after serving a few years of labor, the Africans lived under permanent surveillance, chained, deprived of rights, and with no real guarantee of liberty. Little by little, this thin line would turn into an insurmountable barrier. The presence of these first Africans marked a rupture. Unlike European colonists, they were not seen as future citizens, but as permanent foreigners, different in skin, language, and culture. The color of their skin became a social and legal marker, a convenient justification for lifelong exploitation. Plantation masters quickly realized that this condition could become an economic advantage. While white servants demanded land and freedom after their contracts, Africans could be kept in captivity indefinitely. Living conditions were brutal. These first Africans were forced to live in improvised slave quarters, built of wood and clay, without comfort and without dignity. There, they slept on mats, chained, separated from their families. On the tobacco plantations, the work rhythm was exhausting, from sunrise to sunset. Any resistance was punished at the whipping post, with the lash striking until the skin split open. The pillory became a symbol of public humiliation, where men and women were exposed before all, flogged as a spectacle. Even in the midst of violence, these first Africans brought with them their culture and their strength. Songs, drums, prayers, and oral narratives began to echo silently, preserving the memory of Africa in distant lands. It was a form of cultural resistance, a way of keeping hope alive in the midst of the torment of slavery. African spirituality blended with the imposed Christianity, creating roots that would later give rise to unique traditions of African American culture. As the decades passed, records show that some of those first Africans managed to obtain a kind of limited freedom, forming families and even owning land. But those openings soon closed. From the middle of the 17th century onward, laws were created to institutionalize lifelong and hereditary slavery. A child born to an enslaved African woman, even if the result of rape committed by a white master, was born enslaved. Thus, slavery ceased to be temporary and became a perpetual sentence, passed down from generation to generation. The arrival of the White Lion in 1619, therefore, was more than a simple landing. It was the starting point of a machine that would grow monstrously. What began with 20 Africans would, in 2 centuries, become millions of enslaved men, women, and children in the United States. Every iron chain, every lash of the whip, every tear shed in the plantations had its origin in that founding moment. This history shows us that slavery was not born as something natural, but as a conscious choice, based on economic interests and sustained by racist justifications. It was at that point that the liberty proclaimed by the English colonists revealed its cruelest contradiction. While they fought against the oppression of the British Crown, they imposed chains on other human beings. And so, the summer of 1619 became a watershed. The arrival of the first Africans in Virginia was not just a distant event, but the first page of a book written with blood, pain, and resistance. And it is precisely that resistance, silent yet unbreakable, that would become the flame-lighting centuries of struggle for freedom. Now that we understand how the first arrival of Africans took place, it is time to move on to the next part of this journey. How the system of indentured servitude, seemingly similar for whites and blacks, turned into a brutal regime of lifelong slavery. The transition from free labor to perpetual bondage will show how laws, punishments, and economic interests shaped the structure that would sustain the United States for centuries. In the early years of English colonization in North America, the distinction between servitude and slavery was still unclear. Many poor colonists from England arrived in the lands of Virginia as indentured servants. They committed to work for 4, 5, or even 7 years in exchange for ship passage, food, and shelter. At the end of the contract, they received their freedom, small sums of money, or even a piece of land. This practice helped masters expand their plantations without depending on immediate wages. When the first Africans arrived in 1619, they were initially placed under that same system. But it soon became evident that the treatment given to them was not the same as that given to European servants. While poor whites had hope of achieving freedom and social advancement, Africans were kept in precarious conditions, controlled by iron chains, subjected to the whipping post and the lash, treated as eternal foreigners. The difference of origin and skin color became the most powerful argument to justify limitless exploitation. Little by little, colonial authorities began creating specific laws to define the condition of Africans. One of the most brutal milestones was the legislation that established that the status of the mother would determine the status of the child. This meant that if an enslaved African woman bore a child, even if the result of rape by a white master, that child was born enslaved. Thus, slavery ceased to be temporary and became lifelong and hereditary. This legal detail transformed the lives of thousands of families. While white servants could dream of a future of freedom, Africans knew that their descendants would inherit the chains. The slave quarters thus became not only the place of the present, but the destiny of entire generations. It was the birth of slavery as a solid institution, legalized and passed from parents to children. With the strengthening of this system, plantation masters found the key to expanding their wealth. Growers of tobacco and later cotton realized that profit would be greater if they did not have to free their workers. The enslaved African was not seen as a person, but as property. He or she could be bought, sold, traded, or used as collateral for debt. Many were appraised in market squares, exposed before buyers as if they were animals, examined in their teeth, muscles, and even reproductive capacity. The power of the masters was consolidated through violence. Those who rebelled were punished in exemplary fashion, tied to the whipping post, flogged in public squares, branded with a hot iron, or even executed. The pillory became a symbol of humiliation, reminding all that any attempt to escape would have deadly consequences. At the same time, the overseer, a central figure in the slave system, maintained daily control, watching every move of the captives with a whip in hand. This transition to lifelong slavery also fueled structural racism. Pseudo-scientific theories began to be spread to justify the inferiority of Africans, legitimizing the idea that they were destined for forced labor. Thus, slavery ceased to be merely an economic mechanism and became a cultural and ideological system, rooted in colonial society. For the enslaved Africans, this new reality represented the total loss of hope for freedom. It was not enough to survive the torment of the slave ship or the first plantations. Now, they had to endure the idea that their children and grandchildren would be born in chains. The slave quarters became hereditary prisons, and the iron chain, a cursed inheritance passed from generation to generation. Yet even in the midst of that grim scenario, resistance never disappeared. Many enslaved people continued fleeing into forests, creating hidden communities, seeking support among indigenous peoples. Others resisted silently, preserving their language, passing down songs and dances, teaching their children stories of freedom. The whip could cut the flesh, but it could not erase the memory of a free Africa. This passage from indentured servitude to lifelong slavery was the point of no return. The British colonies had discovered that unlimited exploitation was more profitable, and they would not give it up. The system would grow, sustained by increasingly harsh laws, until it became the foundation of the southern United States economy. And it is at this point that our journey continues, because from the moment lifelong slavery was consolidated, the expansion of plantations and the slave trade would reach unimaginable levels. The next chapter will reveal how the growth of slavery transformed the South into an agricultural empire, dependent on the sweat, blood, and chains of millions of enslaved Africans. From the consolidation of lifelong slavery onward, the system gained strength like never before. The 17th century gave way to a period in which the economy of the southern colonies of the United States would become completely dependent on forced labor. Tobacco, already Virginia's main wealth, expanded as an export product. Soon after, rice and indigo were added to that list, and later cotton would become the true king of the plantations. In every harvest, in every crop, was present the sweat of enslaved Africans, chained in slave quarters, watched by overseers, and punished with the lash. The growth of slavery was not only economic, but also demographic. The importation of Africans through the slave trade increased at a constant pace. Slave ships crossed the Atlantic carrying hundreds of men, women, and children in inhumane conditions. Packed into holds, fastened with shackles, they endured the torment of hunger, thirst, and disease. Many died along the way, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. For the traffickers, each death was only a loss of cargo. For the survivors, it was the beginning of a life of pain on the plantations of the New World. In the South, the landscape of plantations became a symbol of oppression. The big house, with its imposing architecture, represented the power of the masters. Around it, the slave quarters, simple wooden shacks, were the space of precarious survival. There, enslaved families slept on dirt floors, sharing disease, fear, and hope. The contrast between the wealth of the big house and the misery of the slave quarters was the cruelest portrait of colonial society. With the expansion of plantations, violence also grew. The whipping post and the pillory were used to punish those who rebelled or attempted to flee. Public floggings became part of the routine, designed to instill fear and submission. The overseer, always with a whip in hand, represented the constant presence of authority. That violence was not only punishment, it was the mechanism that sustained the system, reminding everyone that freedom was out of reach. However, slavery also fueled contradictions. While the South prospered with plantations and exports, the North began to develop a more diversified economy, based on trade, fishing, and small industries. Although slavery was also present in some regions of the North, its scale was much smaller. This difference would create an abyss between the two regions, a conflict that would later explode into a civil war. The expansion of slavery was directly tied to the triangular trade. Europe sent weapons, textiles, and manufactured goods to Africa. In return, it received enslaved Africans, who were taken to the Americas on slave ships. From there, the colonists sent to Europe tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rice. This economic mechanism transformed human lives into merchandise and generated unimaginable fortunes for merchants and plantation masters. At the end of the 18th century, the growth of slavery reached a new level with the invention of the cotton gin, which made the production of this crop faster and more profitable. Cotton came to be called white gold, and its international demand exploded. Every bale of cotton shipped to Europe carried with it the weight of forced labor, iron chains, and the suffering of thousands of enslaved Africans. This growth also deepened structural racism. Harsher and harsher laws were created to prevent the social advancement of the enslaved. Freedom became nearly unattainable, and Africans were legally treated as property. The body of a slave could be sold, rented, mortgaged, or inherited. In many regions, newspaper ads offered pieces, men, women, and children, as if they were objects. But amid the expansion, resistance never disappeared. Many enslaved people fled into forests, formed maroon communities, or sought refuge in indigenous territories. Others resisted culturally, preserving African songs, dances, and beliefs passed from generation to generation. Even under the constant surveillance of the overseer, even under the crack of the whip, the flame of freedom remained alive. The growth of slavery, therefore, was not only an economic phenomenon, but also a social and cultural one. It transformed colonial society, created regional divisions, and instituted a system of inequality that would deeply mark the history of the United States. From the whipping post to the pillory, from the slave quarters to the big house, from the plantations to international trade, every aspect of colonial life was soaked in the blood of enslaved Africans. And yet, this system was still far from reaching its peak, because while the number of enslaved people increased and plantations expanded, daily suffering became even more cruel. It is in the next chapter that we will dive more deeply into the everyday life of enslaved people, into the pain, the punishments, the abuses, and the silent resistance that marked every sunrise and every night in the American plantations. The daily life of enslaved Africans in the southern colonies of the United States was marked by pain, humiliation, and silent resistance. At dawn, before the sun even rose on the horizon, the sound of whips or the voice of the overseer already called the captives to work. Men, women, and even children were forced to leave the slave quarters, still exhausted from the night, to face another day of labor on the plantations. The slave quarters, simple wooden and clay structures, were unhealthy spaces. The dirt floor served as a bed, and the constant dampness encouraged disease. Many times, entire families were separated, forced to live on different farms, and blood ties were broken by the logic of buying and selling. The iron chains and shackles were not only on ankles and wrists, they were also in the permanent fear of losing a child, a mother, a sibling. On tobacco, rice, and later cotton plantations, the work began at sunrise and extended until nightfall. The workdays were exhausting, and any sign of fatigue could be interpreted as laziness or rebellion. In those cases, punishment was immediate. The whipping post, the pillory, or the lash. Floggings were not only physical punishments, but also spectacles of power. Masters and overseers believed that showing the pain of one was the best way to control all the others. Among the cruelest punishments was the use of the whipping post, where arms and legs were immobilized while the body received blows until the skin split open. In the pillory, humiliation was public. Men and women were exposed before the community, flogged under the eyes of colonists, enslaved people, and even children. Sexual violence was also part of that reality. Enslaved women were frequently abused by masters, overseers, and even the sons of landowners, turned into objects of pleasure and victims of systematic rape. Many mixed-race children were born of that violence, carrying in their very bodies the proof of brutality and inequality. Despite everything, the enslaved found ways to resist. In the silent nights of the slave quarters, African chants echoed softly, bringing memories of the homeland. Dances and drum beats were performed in secret, preserving culture and strengthening the spirit. Spirituality also became a weapon of resistance. Mixing African elements with the imposed Christianity, new forms of faith emerged that offered hope and comfort in the midst of the torment of slavery. Enslaved mothers, even without being able to offer freedom to their children, passed down stories, legends, and songs to keep them connected to their roots. It was an act of love and resistance. teaching that even in chains, they were part of something greater, descendants of kings, warriors, and free peoples. This preservation of cultural identity was fundamental for the spiritual survival of generations. Physical violence was only part of the oppression. Psychological violence corroded dignity every day. Called pieces, evaluated like animals in markets, the enslaved were constantly reminded that they were considered property. They were bought, sold, mortgaged, and traded as if they were agricultural tools. This constant dehumanization aimed to break the spirit, but it never managed to erase completely the desire for freedom. Life in the big house was no less harsh. Enslaved people who worked inside the residences of the masters faced constant pressure. They had to endure daily surveillance, humiliation, and abuse, in addition to direct proximity to their aggressors. Although they could escape the heavy tasks of the field, they were subjected to intense psychological and sexual violence. Even under the cruelest conditions, networks of solidarity arose among the enslaved. Sharing food, passing a song, or protecting someone from punishment was a form of resistance. The sense of community helped keep alive the hope for better days. Many dreamed of escape, and some succeeded. Others preferred to silently sabotage the system, breaking tools, delaying work, feigning illness. These were small victories against an apparently invincible machine of oppression. That routine of suffering and resistance deeply shaped African American culture. From pain were born songs that would later become spirituals, hymns of faith and hope that echoed in the plantations. From violence were born stories of anonymous heroes who dared to challenge the chains. From oppression was born a collective identity that refused to be erased. The life of the enslaved in the United States, therefore, cannot be reduced only to pain. It was marked by resilience, by silent struggle, and by the preservation of humanity in the midst of the hell of the slave quarters and the big house. And it is precisely this resistance that the next chapter will address. Because even in the face of the whip, the pillory, and the whipping post, many rose up against the system. Rebellions, escapes, and maroon communities emerged as responses to violence. Slavery could impose iron chains on the body, but it could never completely imprison the spirit of freedom. Slavery in the United States was built on iron chains, slave quarters, and brutal punishments, but it never ceased to face the invisible force of resistance. From the first Africans disembarked in 1619, the desire for freedom accompanied every heartbeat, every song sung in secret, every glance cast beyond the plantations. That flame of resistance, even muffled by the whip and the pillory, was never extinguished. One of the most common forms of resistance was escape. Many enslaved people risked their lives trying to flee the plantations. They escaped into dense forests, swamps, and mountains, where they formed communities known as maroons. These refugees became symbols of freedom, even though they were constantly threatened by slave catchers. Every successful escape represented not only the victory of one individual, but also a symbolic blow against the system that tried to keep everyone under control. There was also silent resistance, the kind that happened within the daily life of the plantations. Enslaved people pretended to be sick to avoid work, deliberately broke tools, delayed harvests, and passively refused to obey orders. Small acts of disobedience that, although they might have seemed insignificant, undermined the discipline imposed by the overseers. It was proof that even under constant surveillance, freedom still found ways to manifest itself. The preservation of African culture was also a powerful act of resistance. Songs, dances, oral stories, and spiritual traditions were passed from generation to generation, often in secret. These practices not only strengthened community bonds, but also kept alive the identity of a people violently torn from their homeland. In the nights of the slave quarters, the drumbeats echoed as reminders that, despite the chains, they still belonged to a history greater than slavery. Over time, some organized rebellions began to emerge. In the 18th century, small uprisings occurred in different colonies. In 1739, for example, the Stono Rebellion took place in South Carolina, considered one of the largest uprisings of enslaved people of that era. Hundreds rose against their masters, armed with courage and the desire for freedom. Although many of these revolts were brutally crushed, they showed that the slave system was not unquestionable. Resistance also found strength in faith. Many enslaved people reinterpreted the messages of Christianity, transforming them into words of hope. The biblical stories of liberation, such as the Hebrews' escape from Egypt, resonated deeply among them. These accounts became symbols of struggle and inspiration, feeding the belief that, just as Moses had guided his people, one day there would also be deliverance for the children of the slave quarters. Enslaved women played a central role in resistance. In addition to passing down culture and caring for children in the midst of adversity, they often led escapes, protected children, and preserved traditions. They were also constant victims of sexual violence, yet even so, they found ways to transform pain into resilience, ensuring that the flame of freedom did not extinguish within the community. It is important to remember that resistance did not happen only among the enslaved. Some poor white colonists, religious missionaries, and abolitionists began to question the morality of slavery. Although they were a minority in that early period, their voices joined the chorus of those who believed that slavery was incompatible with the ideals of liberty that the United States was beginning to defend. Even in the face of brutality, resistance left deep marks on the system. Every successful escape, every maroon community formed, every organized rebellion was a constant reminder that slavery was neither natural nor accepted without question. The violence of the masters, the punishments at the whipping post, the marks of the lash, the torment of the pillory, was also a response to the fear that captives might rise against them. This first phase of resistance did not manage to destroy the slave system, but it planted the seeds for the future. It showed that slavery could imprison bodies, but would never erase the spirit of struggle. It was resistance that kept African roots alive on American soil, that fueled the dream of freedom, and that inspired generations to continue fighting. And it is precisely at this point that we move on to the next chapter, because as resistance grew, the colonies began to react by creating harsher and harsher laws, transforming slavery into a legal and hereditary institution. Repression would intensify, and the contradiction between liberty and captivity would become increasingly evident in the society that would give birth to the United States. The resistance of the enslaved, expressed in escapes, rebellions, and cultural preservation, made the colonial elites realize the need to reinforce the system. For plantation masters and large landowners, it was essential that slavery be transformed into law, guaranteeing not only its continuity but also its legitimacy in the eyes of society. Thus, from the 17th century, and especially in the 18th century, the so-called slave codes began to appear, legal codes that clearly established the condition of Africans and their descendants as property. These laws represented the definitive institutionalization of slavery. There was no longer room for ambiguity between indentured servitude and lifelong slavery. The colonies began to decree that Africans and their children would be slaves for life. The legal principle that the status of the mother determined the status of the child consolidated hereditary slavery. In other words, even if a child was the result of sexual violence committed by a white master against an African woman, that child was born enslaved. The slave quarters, therefore, ceased to be only the prison of one generation and became a cursed inheritance passed on indefinitely. The slave codes also prohibited any possibility of social advancement for the enslaved. They were forbidden to bear arms, to learn to read and write, to gather in groups, or to testify against whites in court. These measures aim not only to limit their freedom, but also to destroy any attempt at organization. The fear of rebellions led colonial legislators to create a system of constant surveillance, turning the colonists themselves into guardians of the slave order. The full legalization of slavery was also accompanied by an ideology of justification. Pseudo-scientific theories began to circulate, claiming the natural inferiority of Africans. Religious preachers, distorting biblical passages, argued that black people were destined for servitude. These ideas created what we call structural racism, a set of beliefs and practices that naturalized inequality and made the exploitation of millions of human beings acceptable. Meanwhile, slave markets multiplied. Men, women, and children were sold in public squares, evaluated like merchandise. Their bodies were inspected, their physical abilities tested, and their prices defined as if they were animals. Advertisements in colonial newspapers offered slaves for sale or reported escapes, offering rewards to those who captured them. This trade was part of the everyday life of cities, making it impossible to separate the local economy from slavery. The contradiction became evident. The British colonies were moving toward independence, proclaiming the ideals of liberty, equality, and self-determination. But at the same time, they supported a system that completely denied those values to a significant part of the population. This paradox would profoundly mark the identity of the United States, a country that would be born exalting freedom while keeping millions of people in iron chains. The effects of this legalization were devastating in the daily life of the enslaved. The law not only imprisoned them physically, but also legally condemned them to the condition of objects. There was no room for contestation. Any attempt to claim rights was crushed by the force of legislation and the whip of the overseers. The slave quarters thus became the legal symbol of a society that preferred to protect the property of masters rather than recognize the humanity of its workers. Even in the face of this brutal institutionalization, resistance did not disappear. Many enslaved people continued to challenge the system, escaping, forming maroon communities, and preserving their culture. But now they faced an even more powerful enemy. Not only the masters and overseers, but also the law itself, which legitimized violence and oppression. This legal hardening paved the way for the definitive consolidation of slavery as the economic and social pillar of the southern colonies. But it also planted the seeds of an inevitable conflict. Because the harsher slavery became, the greater the contradiction with the ideals of liberty that would shape the new nation. And it is at this point that we move on to the next chapter. Now that slavery had become law, we need to understand how the past of 1619 would echo in the centuries that followed, shaping the future of the United States and leaving marks that still influence society today. The summer of 1619, when the ship White Lion brought the first Africans to Virginia, may seem like a distant point in time. But its consequences continue to shape the present. What began with only 20 men and women disembarking at Point Comfort grew until it became millions of lives scarred by the slave quarters, the whipping post, the lash, and the pillory. Slavery ceased to be merely an economic system. It became the foundation upon which the United States was built. The roots of structural racism are anchored in that founding moment. When Africans were reduced to the condition of merchandise, sold in markets, chained in slave ships, and transformed into property, a logic was initiated that would surpass generations. Skin color began to be used as justification for inequality, and that mindset did not disappear with the end of legal slavery. It persisted in segregationist laws, in discriminatory social practices, and in the inequalities that still today are reflected in access to education, healthcare, and justice. The memory of slavery is present in every historical symbol. The old plantation houses and cotton fields still exist as silent witnesses. The iron chains displayed in museums recall the shackles that once bound men, women, and children. The spirituals, the songs of faith sung on plantations, became hymns of resistance that still echo in choirs, churches, and African American cultural expressions. Yesterday's pain remains alive in today's identity. Understanding the connection between past and present is essential. It is not just about looking back with sorrow, but about comprehending how choices made more than 4 centuries ago still influence lives in the 21st century. Slavery shaped the economy, generated fortunes, sustained empires, and left scars that manifest themselves in struggles for racial equality. Every broken chain, every escape, every rebellion is part of a historical line that leads directly to the battles for civil rights, for dignity, and for recognition. By revisiting the first arrival of Africans in the United States, we see not only a historical milestone, but also a mirror. The reflection of a society that was born proclaiming liberty while denying humanity to millions. The reflection of a contradiction that still generates debates and social movements. The reflection of a struggle that began in 1619 and continues to this day, every time someone raises their voice against injustice. This connection with the future reminds us that slavery is not only past, it is also present responsibility. Knowing this history is the first step to preventing it from repeating itself in new forms of exploitation and discrimination. And it is precisely with this perspective that we will move on to the final chapter of this narrative, the conclusion. A moment to reflect on everything that has been revealed and to reinforce that by remembering we also resist. And by resisting, we build a future in which chains will finally have no place. The story we have traveled so far began with the distant sound of iron chains on a ship called the White Lion in 1619. 20 Africans disembarked in Virginia without imagining that they were inaugurating a dark chapter that would last for more than 2 centuries. What began as an isolated negotiation soon turned into a legal, economic, and cultural system, sustained by the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of enslaved men, women, and children. Along this path, we saw how slavery was born of economic interests, consolidated by laws, and expanded until it became the foundation of an entire society. We witnessed the brutal contrast between the big house and the slave quarters, between the luxury of the masters and the misery of the captives. We heard the echo of the whips at the whipping post and the pillory, felt the pain of separated families, the silence of violated women, the silent resistance of those who, even in chains, preserved their culture, their faith, and their hope. Slavery in the United States was not only a system of forced labor, it was a project of dehumanization. It turned people into property, erased identities, and built fortunes at the cost of pain. But despite all the brutality, it never managed to extinguish the flame of resistance. In the escapes to maroon communities, in the organized rebellions, in the songs sung in the nights of the slave quarters, in the eyes that dreamed of freedom, humanity remained alive. Understanding this history is more than an academic exercise. It is a duty of memory, because the past did not remain trapped in the past. It breathes in the present, in every social inequality, in every racial injustice, in every fight for rights that still must be fought. The structural racism that marked the nation's birth continues to echo centuries later, reminding us that the physical chains were broken, but other invisible chains still persist. By revisiting the first arrival of Africans in the United States, we also discover a mirror. This mirror forces us to confront the contradictions of a society that was born proclaiming liberty while institutionalizing slavery. It forces us to reflect on how the pursuit of profit and power was stronger than respect for human dignity. It forces us, above all, to assume responsibility for the present and the future. But this is not only a tale of pain, it is also a celebration of resilience, of the courage of women who nursed children knowing they could be sold, of men who endured the whipping post without allowing their faith to be destroyed, of communities that even under surveillance preserved songs, stories, and traditions that today are an essential part of African American culture. That resistance is the true inheritance of those who arrived in 1619, the certainty that freedom can be delayed, but never denied forever. And that is why remembering is resisting. Every time we tell this story, every time we name the horrors of the slave ship, the slave quarters, the pillory, we are refusing to allow the pain to be erased. We are ensuring that future generations understand that the freedom of some cannot exist on the slavery of others. We are reaffirming that justice exists only when memory is preserved. Today, as we look back, we understand that slavery is not only part of the past of the United States, but part of the construction of the entire modern world. The cotton that enriched empires, the sugar that sweetened European tables, the tobacco that circulated in markets, all of it was based on the labor of chained people. Slavery was global, but its memory is personal. It is made of individual stories, forgotten names, lives that still deserve to be honored. That is why, as we close this narrative, I leave an invitation that each of us carry this memory forward, that we recognize in the pain of the past the responsibility of the present, that we understand there are still chains to be broken, invisible chains that manifest in inequality, prejudice, and the silence that insists on erasing stories. And above all, that every viewer understands the value of freedom, because every right that today we take for granted was conquered at the cost of immense suffering. To honor this history is to ensure that it never happens again. If this story has touched you, if it has opened your eyes to truths that history has often tried to hide, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and help carry this memory forward. Because telling is resisting, and resisting is the only way to build a future where chains, visible or invisible, will no longer have a place.